English from Australia, pelajaran nomor 35. Saudara pendengar, dalam pelajaran yang lalu, Chris dan Iwan telah membicarakan rencana perjalanan ke Indonesia dan juga beberapa perbedaan antara Australia dan Indonesia yang mungkin akan dirasakan oleh Chris. Berikut ini, mereka sedang bercakap-cakap dengan Helen. Perhatikan bagaimana mereka menyatakan perbandingan dalam bahasa Inggris.
The weather's more humid than Sydney's.
Yes, and the scenery's more beautiful, I suppose.
Well, the scenery in Sydney is very beautiful too, Helen.
Anyway, Jakarta's hotter than Sydney.
Sekarang, mereka akan membicarakan jalan yang akan mereka tempuh.
We can go by plane. We can fly from Sydney to Jakarta. Or we can go to Perth by train, and from Perth to Jakarta by plane.
What do you think, Helen?
Well, it's a long way from Sydney to Perth. Is Bali very nice, Iwan?
Oh, yes. It's a beautiful place.
One of my friends went there last year. Is it like Jakarta?
Well, Bali is an island, of course, and it's a lot smaller than Java, and the capital, Denpasar, is smaller than Jakarta.
Bali's close to Australia.
Mereka akan melihat peta yang dalam bahasa Inggris,
A map. Here, let's look at this map. Let's see. There's Sydney. There's Darwin. There's Bali, Helen.
Darwin's close to Indonesia.
Oh, yes. And Darwin's very hot.
Is it much hotter than Sydney?
Yes, and it's wetter too. It rains a lot in Darwin. Darwin's a lot wetter than Sydney.
Is it like Indonesia?
The weather in Darwin's like the weather in Jakarta.
It isn't as hot as Jakarta.
But it's hotter than Sydney and it's wetter too.
Chris dan Iwan akan memperbandingkan beberapa kota. Coba dengarkan.
Sydney's hot in summer.
Darwin's hotter than Sydney.
Darwin isn't as hot as Jakarta.
That's right. Sydney's humid in summer.
Darwin's more humid than Sydney.
Darwin isn't as humid as Jakarta.
What about Brisbane? Is Brisbane a big city?
It's bigger than Darwin, but it isn't as big as Jakarta.
Is it hotter than Sydney?
Yes, it's hotter than Sydney.
But it isn't as hot as Darwin.
That's right. It isn't as hot as Darwin.
It rains a lot in Darwin.
Yes, Darwin's wetter than Sydney.
But it isn't as wet as Jakarta. It doesn't always rain in Jakarta. Jakarta's sunny too.
Sydney's sunny. It's sunnier than Melbourne, but it isn't as sunny as Darwin.
Iwan, Helen, dan Chris juga akan membicarakan bagaimana cara untuk pergi ke Indonesia. Apakah akan naik pesawat terbang atau naik kereta api ke Perth dan kemudian naik pesawat terbang dari Perth ke Jakarta.
We can go from Sydney to Jakarta by plane.
Or we can go by ship. Or we can go by train to Perth and by plane from Perth to Jakarta.
That's a long trip, Chris.
Yes, I know. Some students went last year. It's very interesting, and you can see Adelaide and Perth.
Well, a plane's faster than a ship, of course.
Yes, and it's more expensive than a train, but it isn't as comfortable as a ship.
And a ship's slower, of course. But it's more interesting, I think.
Planes are interesting too, you know.
But are they comfortable?
Saudara pendengar, coba dengarkan beberapa keterangan lagi tentang kota Darwin. Chris akan mengatakan bahwa Darwin adalah ibu kota yang paling panas di Australia.
Darwin's the hottest capital city in Australia. It's hotter than Brisbane, and it's hotter than Sydney too. It's the hottest city in Australia. It's the hottest city in Australia.
Coba dengarkan ungkapan yang berarti paling panas.
The hottest. The hottest. It's the hottest city in Australia.
Kita tambahkan satu suku pada kata yang berarti panas.
Hot. Hottest.
Suku kata tersebut ialah est, E-S-T. Perhatikan bunyi teh pada akhir suku kata itu.
Hot. Hottest.
Sekarang coba ucapkan sesudah Chris.
Hottest.
Apakah saudara masih ingat bagaimana kita memperbandingkan dua hal kalau yang satu lebih besar, lebih panas, dan sebagainya daripada yang lain?
Hot. Hotter. Sydney's hotter than Melbourne.
Nah, untuk berbicara tentang lebih dari dua tempat, di mana yang satu merupakan yang paling besar, paling sering hujan, paling panas, dibandingkan dengan semua tempat yang kita bicarakan, kita pakai bunyi
Est. Hottest. Darwin is the hottest city in Australia. It's hotter than Sydney. It's hotter than Melbourne. And it's hotter than Brisbane too. It's the hottest city in Australia.
Oh ya, kalau kita berbicara tentang yang paling besar, paling panas, dan sebagainya, kita membedakan satu hal tertentu yang lebih besar dan lebih panas daripada yang lain. Jadi, kita juga memakai kata
the hottest, the biggest.
Coba ucapkan beberapa kalimat sesudah Chris.
Darwin's the hottest city in Australia. It's the wettest city in Australia too.
Kita juga dapat berbicara tentang bagaimana cerahnya udara sesuatu kota. Artinya, berapa hari setahun kota itu mendapat sinar matahari.
Sydney's sunny, but Brisbane's sunnier than Sydney. But it isn't as sunny as Darwin. Darwin's the sunniest city in Australia.
Coba dengarkan lagi kata-kata yang dipakai tadi.
Sunny, sunnier, the sunniest. Sunnier than Brisbane, the sunniest city in Australia.
Coba ulangi sesudah Chris.
The sunniest city in Australia. Darwin's the sunniest city in Australia.
Oh, it's wet. It's raining.
It rains a lot in Darwin too. It rains in December and January and February. Darwin's wetter than Sydney, and it's wetter than Melbourne too. Darwin's the wettest capital in Australia.
Sekarang coba ucapkan sesudah Helen.
The wettest capital in Australia. Darwin's the wettest capital in Australia.
It isn't as wet as Jakarta.
I know something else about Darwin, Iwan. It's small. It's the smallest capital city in Australia.
Really? What about Hobart?
Darwin's smaller than Hobart. It's the smallest capital city in Australia.
And Sydney's the biggest capital city in Australia.
Hobart adalah ibu kota Tasmania, negara bagian yang paling kecil di Australia. Tetapi, Hobart kira-kira 4 kali lebih besar daripada Darwin. Coba ucapkan sebuah contoh lagi sesudah Chris, bagian demi bagian.
The smallest capital in Australia. Darwin's the smallest capital in Australia.
Dan Tasmania adalah suatu pulau. Dalam bahasa Inggris,
Island. An island. Tasmania's an island.
There are a lot of islands in Indonesia. Sumatra, Kalimantan, Java, Bali, Sulawesi, and so on. Kalimantan is the biggest island in Indonesia.
What about Java?
No, Kalimantan is bigger than Java.
Australia's an island too. It's the biggest island in the world.
Kalimantan is the biggest island in Indonesia.
And Australia's the biggest island in the world.
Dan sekarang, Iwan akan mengatakan bahwa Indonesia mempunyai penduduk yang lebih banyak daripada Australia.
Indonesia has a larger population than Australia.
Sebenarnya, Indonesia merupakan bangsa yang terbesar di Asia Tenggara.
Indonesia is the biggest nation in Southeast Asia.
Saudara pendengar, mari kita berlatih lagi. Pertama-tama tentang Darwin. Iwan akan bertanya, misalnya,
Is Darwin hot?
dan saudara hendaknya menjawab,
Yes, it's the hottest capital in Australia.
jangan lupa mengucapkan kata the. Helen akan memberikan jawaban yang betul. Ulangilah jawaban itu. Siap, saudara-saudara?
Is Darwin wet?
Yes, it's the wettest capital in Australia.
Is Darwin sunny?
Yes, it's the sunniest capital in Australia.
Is Darwin small?
Yes, it's the smallest capital in Australia.
Is Darwin hot?
Yes, it's the hottest capital in Australia.
Sekarang, Iwan akan bertanya tentang Sydney.
Is Sydney a big city?
Yes, it's the biggest city in Australia.
Baiklah. Kali ini, Helen akan bertanya tentang Kalimantan.
Is Kalimantan a big island?
Yes, it's the biggest island in Indonesia.
Indonesia mempunyai banyak sekali pulau, bukan? Di Australia, kebanyakan orang tinggal di salah satu dari dua pulau, yaitu daratan Australia dan Pulau Tasmania.
There are a lot of islands in Indonesia. We've got one big island, Tasmania. It's a nice place.
Is it cold?
Well, it's colder than Sydney.
Saudara pendengar, tadi kami berbicara tentang ibu kota. Di Australia, setiap negara bagian mempunyai ibu kota. Misalnya, Adelaide adalah ibu kota negara bagian South Australia. Seperti saudara ketahui, ibu kota Australia ialah Canberra. Dalam bahasa Inggris,
The capital of Australia is Canberra.
Is Canberra the biggest city in Australia?
No, Sydney's the biggest.
Well, Canberra isn't the smallest.
No, Darwin's the smallest.
And Canberra isn't the hottest.
No.
Well, is Canberra the coldest or the wettest city?
No, it isn't. But I think it's... the most important?
Coba dengarkan Helen lagi. Dia akan mengatakan, kota itu yang paling penting.
It's the most important. It's the most important.
Untuk memperbandingkan dua hal dengan menggunakan kata sifat yang panjang, seperti important, kita pakai kata
More. More important.
tetapi kalau kita memperbandingkan lebih dari dua hal dengan menggunakan kata sifat yang panjang, kita pakai ungkapan
The most. The most. The most important. The most important.
Canberra is the most important city in Australia.
Coba ucapkan sesudah Helen.
The most important. Canberra is the most important city in Australia. Canberra is the most important city in Australia.
Baiklah. Sekarang, coba dengarkan sedikit keterangan lagi tentang Canberra. Kota itu modern dalam bahasa Inggris.
It's modern. It's modern.
Coba ucapkan sesudah Chris.
It's modern. Yes, E1. It's the most modern city in Australia.
Is it beautiful?
Oh, yes. I've got a friend in Canberra. He says Canberra's the most beautiful city in Australia.
Coba ulangi beberapa contoh tentang Canberra sesudah Helen. Siap, saudara-saudara?
Canberra is the most important city in Australia. It's the most modern city in Australia. It's the most beautiful city in Australia.
Saudara pendengar, mari kita kembali pada pembicaraan kita tentang Indonesia. Iwan akan menceritakan tentang Bali kepada Chris, yaitu tentang pura-pura Hindu di Besakih. Dalam bahasa Inggris,
Hindu temples.
Bali has large Hindu temples at Besakih.
What are they like?
They're the biggest and the most important temples in Bali.
coba dengarkan lagi kalimat-kalimat Iwan.
Besakih's got the most important temples in Bali. It's got the biggest temple in Bali.
Sekarang, coba ulangi sesudah Iwan.
It's got the most important temples in Bali. It's got the biggest temple in Bali.
And what about Borobudur?
Well, Helen, it's the most famous temple in Indonesia.
Nah, bagaimana kita dapat pergi ke sana? Bagaimana perjalanan ke Indonesia? Dalam bahasa Inggris,
Travelling to Indonesia.
We can go by plane from Sydney.
Or you can go by ship.
Or we can go by train to Perth and by plane from Perth to Jakarta. That's the most interesting.
Traveling by plane's the most expensive.
Travelling by ship's the most comfortable.
Travelling by train's the most interesting.
saudara pendengar, coba ucapkan contoh-contoh itu. Helen akan bertanya, misalnya,
Is travelling by plane expensive?
dan saudara hendaknya menjawab,
It's the most expensive.
jawaban itu berarti bahwa perjalanan dengan pesawat terbang adalah yang paling mahal kalau dibandingkan dengan perjalanan dengan kendaraan-kendaraan lain. Chris akan memberikan jawaban yang betul. Ulangilah jawaban itu. Nah, mari kita mulai dengan pertanyaan yang pertama.
Is travelling by ship comfortable?
It's the most comfortable.
Is travelling by train interesting?
It's the most interesting.
Is travelling by plane expensive?
It's the most expensive.
Yes, that's right. It's the most expensive, but it's the fastest.
And it's quite comfortable for a short trip.
Yes, I think it's okay.
A ship's more comfortable, but it's slower.
Saudara pendengar, sekarang Chris, Helen, dan Iwan akan melanjutkan pembicaraan mereka tentang perjalanan ke Indonesia. Mereka akan mengatakan apa yang merupakan gagasan yang baik.
A good idea.
Dan apa yang merupakan gagasan yang lebih baik.
A better idea.
Kalau kita ingin membuat suatu perbandingan dengan kata yang artinya baik, maka kata itu tidak kita ubah. Tetapi sebagai gantinya, kita pergunakan kata yang baru, yaitu
better. Better.
Coba ucapkan sesudah Chris.
Better.
Dan untuk menyatakan sesuatu yang paling baik, ungkapannya ialah
the best. The best. The best idea.
Coba ucapkan sesudah Chris.
The best idea. Travelling by ship's a good idea. It's slow, but it's comfortable.
Travelling by train to Perth's a better idea because you can see a lot of Australia. You can see Adelaide.
But it's very hot between Adelaide and Perth at the end of the year, and it's a long way, and there isn't much time, and Iwan wants to see his family.
Travelling by plane's the best idea. It's quick and you can have a longer time in Indonesia. You can see Iwan's family and visit some places in Indonesia.
Yes, I agree. That's the best idea.
Coba dengarkan lagi.
A good idea. A better idea. The best idea.
Coba ulangi ungkapan-ungkapan itu sesudah Helen.
A good idea. A better idea. The best idea.
Saudara pendengar, sekarang mereka akan berbicara tentang waktu yang paling baik untuk berkunjung ke Indonesia.
By the way, is December a good time to visit Indonesia?
It's a good time, but it's not the best time to visit Indonesia.
What's the best time?
The best time's from June to August. December's better than January, but the best time's from June to August.
Why is that the best time, Iwan?
Well, the weather's dry. It's hot, of course. It's always hot in Indonesia, but it doesn't rain much from June to August.
Coba dengarkan Chris lagi.
A good time. A better time. The best time.
Sekarang, coba ucapkan sesudah Chris.
A good time. A better time. The best time.
Mereka juga harus memikirkan pakaian apa yang baik untuk iklim di Indonesia. Mereka akan menyebutkan pakaian dalam bahasa Inggris,
Clothes.
dan bahan yang paling baik,
The best material.
yaitu katun.
Cotton. What about clothes?
Well, the best clothes for Indonesia are light clothes, cool clothes. Cotton's the best material. It's the lightest and the coolest.
Saudara pendengar, sekarang giliran saudara untuk berlatih. Saudara akan mendengar pertanyaan, misalnya,
Is travelling by plane a good idea?
dan saudara hendaknya menjawab.
Yes, it's the best idea.
Chris akan memberikan jawaban yang betul. Ulangilah jawaban itu.
Is cotton a good material?
Yes, it's the best material.
Is June a good time?
Yes, it's the best time.
Is travelling by plane a good idea?
Yes, it's the best idea.
Ya, saya kira the best idea untuk saat ini ialah mendengarkan musik sebentar. Saudara pendengar, Iwan dan Chris ingin mendapatkan keterangan lebih lanjut tentang perjalanan ke Indonesia pada akhir tahun. Mereka telah memutuskan untuk pergi ke sebuah biro perjalanan dan mereka baru saja duduk di kantor tersebut.
Now, gentlemen, where do you want to go?
To Indonesia.
To Indonesia. Oh, marvellous, wonderful. It's the most wonderful place in the world. The scenery is fantastic. And the people, they're very friendly. They're the friendliest people in the world. Now, do you want to go by plane?
I think so.
Yes, that's the best idea. Now, take this booklet. It's got the most useful information about fares and times of departure and so on. Ah, yes. It's a wonderful place.
When were you in Indonesia?
Me? Oh, I haven't been to Indonesia. I never leave Australia.
Why not?
I don't like travelling. The safest way to travel is to stay at home and read a book about travel.
Well, how do you know about Indonesia?
My brother went there last year. He's still there. He writes to me once or twice a month. And I've got photographs of Indonesia. Beautiful. The most beautiful scenery in the world. But it's very hot. I don't like hot weather.
Why not?
Well, it makes me sick. I can't talk. I don't like hot weather. When my brother writes me letters about the hot weather in Jakarta, I take off my clothes and sit in the bath. Then I read the letters. The bathroom's the coolest place in the house. Now, take that booklet and these pamphlets and think about your trip. I'm going to have some lunch now. Come back tomorrow. Bye.
Well, he's the strangest travel agent in Sydney.
And the most talkative. Now, let's have a look at this booklet.
Saudara pendengar, sekarang sudah tiba saatnya bagi kami untuk minta diri. Jangan lupa membaca bagian yang berjudul sesudah siaran dari pelajaran tadi. Dan jangan lupa pula mempelajari bagian yang berjudul sebelum siaran dari pelajaran nomor 36. Dan sekarang kami ucapkan goodbye listeners.